after 12. Welcome back to those of you who are here yesterday. Welcome to the second day of our second annual Research CLE series. Today we're going to talk about Indian law research, and I invited Maylin Smith to come along in case anybody has any more substantive questions as we go along, because I can't answer those nearly as well as she can. Couple of things. If you haven't signed in, make sure you sign in to get your CLE credits. I will later this afternoon email you a CLE certificate if you sign in, just for those of you who were here yesterday, just like I did yesterday. There's also handouts for this CLE up here, and two other handouts. One about, actually I should let you talk about the summer program as well.
Yeah, okay.
One about the summer program and one about Indian Law Week next week. So I'm going to actually let Maylin talk about both of those.
So up there is a brochure on Indian Law Week, which is next week. There's also free CLE credits as part of that. Those are during the noon hour that they have a CLE or an hour CLE presentation. The first one on Monday is dealing with biocultural resiliency. It's dealing with the bull trout restoration up on Confederated Settlers Cootie on Flathead Reservation. Then the second day, we have the Columbia River Treaty, information on that and the renewal of the Columbia River Treaty as well. The Wednesday is natural resource development and law enforcement needs. That will be Dana Jackson from the U.S. Attorney's Office will be coming over for that. We have a continuing legal education series on Thursday at the Holiday Inn. That one is not free, but it's a reduced rate. It's in connection with the bar. The brochure up there, the handout tells you all the information. I'm not going to go through that. And then on Friday, we have a one trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, the challenges of mitigating the cultural impacts of development, looking primarily at Northern Cheyenne on Friday at noon. So, pardon?
What did you say you think it was?
There's some right over here.
Oh, besides.
Yeah. And then just so you know that the 16th, we also have Evening with NALSA, which has a silent auction component. All that information is on this sheet that's up there. We started a summer Indian law program in 2008 here, and as part of that summer Indian law program, we do week-long intensive courses on a variety of Indian law topics. They are worth 1 credit of academic or 15 CLE credits. Those are not free, but there is a listing up there of those courses as well, and that's basically over 8 weeks this summer. And if you have any additional questions about either of these, you can come talk to me after this presentation here.
Great. Thank you. So definitely ask questions as we go along. You know, if I'd say anything you want me to elaborate on, I want to make sure I answer the questions that you have. So shout them out, raise your hand, whatever. This CLE is actually kind of a shortened version of one of the classes in the Indian Law Summer Program. Every year, the first class of the program is an Indian Law Research class that kind of sets the basis for the rest. So this, I cover most of this in the class much more in depth. So this is the abbreviated version. The first thing actually that we need to do is make a distinction between Indian law and tribal law. And I'm not going to read these to you, they're on your sheet. Indian law is essentially the law of the relationship between the tribes and the government. And usually it's the federal government. In some instances we are talking about state government, but it's those laws that we're talking about. So we talk about federal Indian law a lot. Tribal law, on the other hand, is the law of each individual tribe. You can analogize it to the law of a foreign country, for example. You know, Canada has law, and Brazil has its own law, and all countries have their own law. Tribes can also have their own laws. So we could be talking about, you know, there's 556 federally recognized tribes, and I don't even know how many unrecognized tribes that could have some sort of legal system as well. But even if we just start with 566 federally recognized tribes, we have potentially 566 legal systems. Not all of them have tribal courts, but there are over 300 tribal courts. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about Indian law. And we're going to talk about researching both of those today as we go through. I should mention too, as I go throughout this, there are links that you will see in there When I email you your CLE certificates later, I will email you the electronic version of this so that you have all of the links available to you. I actually want to start out, though, now that I've talked about links, start out talking about a couple of print sources, because there are some good basic sources to start your research. One is probably the most basic, the American Indian Law in a nutshell. Most of you have probably used nutshells in the past, and you know they're very good starting places if you're starting from a I know nothing kind of a place, which sometimes with Indian law concepts we might be, even with terminology. Take the term Indian country, for example, that you will read in a lot of Indian law cases, statutes. What does it mean? You can start with something like this. It's not going to give you a complete understanding, but it will at least give you enough understanding to start your research. A more in-depth source, though, is Cohen's Handbook of Federal Indian Law. And this is kind of the starting place for when I use it actually quite often myself in doing Indian law research. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but this is where you're going to get the in-depth treatment, more comprehensive treatment. You'll also get citations to statutes and cases so that you can start your research. Just a note about Cohen's, though, because this is an instance where it really does matter which edition you use. This also, in many ways, kind of reflects, the history of Cohen reflects a little bit about the development of Indian law in the U.S. Cohen was actually a scholar, and he worked for the Department of the Interior, but he was an advocate for tribal self-government. So when he wrote the original handbook in 1942, it reflected that stance of his, and he took the position that tribes should have self-government, that tribes had legal rights, and that federal government power was restricted by those. So that was the original 1942 version, and actually we still have that. The 1942 version is the version that is online for free. There's a link to it, I think, on the next slide. But in 1958, Cohen's was revised, and Cohen did not do the revision in 1958, but it was revised because of federal Indian law at that time. That was the period of termination, and Cohen's was not consistent at all with termination, so the Department of Interior completely revised Cohen's Handbook. It still retained the name Cohen's Handbook, even though he did not write the revision. It's largely regarded not to be scholarly. However, the one thing it did do was include additional newer case citations, but that's really all it was useful for. In 1971, after the Indian Civil Rights Act, part of the Indian Civil Rights Act is that they said that the original 1942 had to be republished, that the 1958 version needed to go away, and so they ordered the republication in 1968, and in 1971 it was finally published. So you'll see one occasionally that has a 1971 publication date, but really it's the 1942, just republished to get rid of that 1958. And then finally in 1982 there was a new edition. And then since then, and then it was, what, 15 more years before we had another edition. In 2005, Lexis now picked it up in 2005 and has been publishing more recent editions since then. So there was a 2005 and a 2012 edition. So the 2012 is the most recent. One thing is important would be to use the most recent edition. Especially the 2012 has added new topics that weren't like Indian gaming, that probably weren't even in 1942 or in 1982 real big issues. Also, specific groups like Native Hawaiians have been added to the newer edition. So you would probably want to start with the newer edition, in which it reflects the development. It also reflects the development of Indian law since 1942. We have several copies of this in the library that you can check out if you need to. So that's kind of a, be wary of the edition that you use because they are different. There's also some good online sources that I want to point out to you. I'm going to talk about Hein Online, but Hein Online is a subscription resource. You can use it anywhere on campus though, so if you happen to be in a library or if you're over in Mansfield Library or anywhere else on campus, you can access it. But Hein Online has a very good American Indian law collection, and this is a historical collection. So It may not be, probably won't be as helpful if you're researching current aspects of Indian law, but if you need to do any historical research, this collection has thousands of historical documents, and they seem kind of random actually, but they've just been, Heinz been gathering what documents they can in libraries and other repositories and just adding them to this collection, and they're still adding them. So that's just something to keep in mind, and we have computers up in the reading room upstairs that anybody can use and access any of the documents in this collection. The other ones, though, are ones you can access. The Montana Indian Law Portal is a page that was, gosh, it's probably been 6 years now, that the State Law Library and Office of Public Instruction worked together on. The idea was to gather tribal law from all of the Montana tribes. So you can see it has constitutions and tribal codes, tribal court decisions, and then links to treaties and compacts and things like that. So it's useful, but I will give you a caveat to it in that there was never any funding for updating it. So the original material is very good. It has not been updated consistently at all. Some of that doesn't matter, like the treaties, fine. They don't need to be updated. That treaty is good. Some of these I would be wary of using the tribal codes, however. And the tribal court decisions are not going to be, what's there is good, they are not going to be comprehensive at all. And then sometimes all of the tribes are listed, but not all of the tribes are going to have decisions or something like that. So it is a little bit limited, but it does still have some use. And there are links also to the tribes, and so sometimes that's the best way. Use the links to the tribes and see if they have their code, their code, or their cases on their own websites. So another one. This actually, there we go. Whoops. This research guide. Most of the things that are on this research guide are actually linked on the PowerPoint that I'll send you later. This is a research guide I built to go along with the class that I teach in the summer. So most everything we talk about is reflected on here. And what it is meant to do is essentially provide you links and information about the sources that you may use at various steps in your research. So some of this we'll talk more about as we go through today, but if I go to the Federal Indian Law tab, for example, here's where you can link to some of the statutes. Here's Indian Claims Commission decisions. We'll talk about all this tribal law. There are links to some tribal law resources. It also, the guide also points to things that, and we'll go back to treaty research, also points to things that may not be online but that we have available in the library. So if you need some of these sources, you can check them out from us, and this gives you just an idea of where you might want to go with your research. Another good source is the National Indian Law Library, which entirely changed their website in like the past 3 weeks. It's beautiful. I love it, but I got on it last night and thought, wow, that looks really different. There is not a link on this slide on your handout. I realized at the last minute I left it off, but there are several links later on, and we'll actually talk about this a little bit more later on. But the National Indian Law Library has long kind of been a go-to for particularly tribal law research, which we'll talk about at the end of class, but they have some very good resources. They also have I think it's under here, well, there. You can actually, they have a online help request form that they can, and they have a very small staff, but a very good staff that very knowledgeable who can help you. So they're an excellent source as well, just kind of in the basic arena. Okay, so with all that, let's start by talking about researching federal Indian law. And I actually don't have too much to talk about here because this is very much like researching any federal case law, federal statutes that you have. I will point out a couple of things. One, Many, but not all of the statutes are in Title 25 of the United States Code. There are also a few in Title 18 in the criminal statutes, and there's some in Title 42 as well. But the bulk of them you'll find in Title 25. The regulations that go along with those happen to be also in Title 25 of the Code of Federal Regulations. The titles of the U.S. Code and the titles of the Code of Federal Regulations don't always correspond, but that's one area where they do. However, this is also, my biggest hint here is always use an annotated code in Indian law. You can read the statutes, but there has been a lot of development, and sure Malin would back this up, a lot of development with all of the statutes. Not always consistent development either. Courts are not always consistently applying these statutes. So you want to have access to the case law that goes along with the statute. So an annotated code is the best place to start. An annotated code will also give you the law review articles that you might want to use to kind of enhance your research. If you don't have an annotated code, because they're really only available on Lexis and Westlaw, I will show you a trick that I use to kind of get around that to the extent that I can. How many of you are familiar with Google Scholar? Google Scholar is just at scholar.google.com. It is not searching all of Google. It is it has its own search engine. And when they built Google Scholar, I used to be a little bit wary about it, but they built Google Scholar and the search engine and the search algorithms with the idea of people searching for legal materials in mind. Their case law database, although they've never really said where it is from, is a comprehensive case law database. You'll find the same cases that you find on Lexis and Westlaw on Google Scholar. There's only been one case I was looking for that I couldn't find, and it was like an 1898 case from Alabama or something like that, and that's the only one I've never been able to find. I've always been able, so I am confident that it is a comprehensive case law search. So you can, I'm going to click on select courts here. You can search as many or as few courts as you want. So if you want to search federal courts, which when you're doing Indian law you may want to, you can search also state Supreme Courts, state appellate courts. You can mix and match all of these. I'm actually just going to leave it and search all courts. And just put, so this is, that's the right statute, one of the IPWA statutes. So if let's say I don't have an annotated code available to me, I'm just going to use the statute as a search term, figuring any case about it is going to mention it somewhere in the case. So it's kind of a workaround to having an annotated code available to you. It's not quite as focused as an annotated code. If you have an annotated code, what you'll get in the annotations are the cases that apply and interpret the statute. So those cases that you need. This search is going to get any case that cites the statute in whatever capacity. But it is organizing them in a relevancy, so the statutes that talk most, or the cases that talk most about your statute are likely the ones that actually apply your statute, and they're going to rise to the top. So the other thing you can do from here, and you can mix and match, you can search all courts like I did, and then say you want to hone in just on what Montana did, or you want to see what the Ninth Circuit did with the statute. The other thing you can do, though, if I go up here to articles, is it is also at the same time searching a database of scholarly articles. Not necessarily just law reviews, but the reality is most of the legal things are pulling from law reviews. But I can see on this you may pull from something like a social work journal or something like that and get kind of a broader scope. Some of these articles will be available to you for free, and you can just click on the link and pull up the article. Others of them may be in subscription databases, but the reality is that almost all of them we have access to. So If you find an article here that you can't access, just send me an email and say, can you shoot me this article? It'll take me like 2 minutes to download it and email it to you. And we're always happy to do that. So this is another good way to kind of enhance that research. And sometimes these articles will kind of help a little bit, especially as the law has, the Indian law continues to develop. So that's my workaround to, if you don't have an annotated code available to you. My other hint is to start with a secondary source, and I'm going to go back to Cohen's, at least to get the lay of the land, especially if it's an area that's very new to you. But Cohen's will give you so much more than just a general lay of the land, and you'll get a pretty good understanding of your issues and where you need to be going. Okay, so one of the unique features of researching federal Indian law that is distinct from other areas of federal law that you've researched in the past are treaties. These are the basis of those relationships, so you can't ignore the treaties themselves in many cases. And this is when we're starting to get into some more factual applications, but the provisions of, not all of the provisions of all of the treaties, but the provisions of the treaties are still applicable. Just a little bit of kind of, this is just general background to the treaties. The federal government has been making treaties with tribes as long as there has been the federal government. In fact, even before, there were, well, here we have, starting with 1778, some colonial treaties with tribes. But before that, tribes made treaties with colonial governments, also with the French and the Spaniards and the British, whoever else was here. So there are treaties that predate the U.S., but the ones that are applicable to federal Indian law are those ones beginning in 1778. And this is very general, kind of the general development of treaty making. The earliest treaties were peace treaties, friendship treaties. And then they started to move into land cession, removal treaties, and finally you get the reservation treaties toward the end. In 1871, the federal government stopped making treaties with tribes. Well, it's kind of more involved than that, but the general upshot is Congress got in a fight with itself. And the House was mad because the Senate got all of the, the Senate had to ratify treaties. The House didn't get to do anything with it. So in the end, they stopped making treaties. Now, that doesn't mean they stopped making agreements with tribes. They were just no longer the formal treaties. After 1871, you have documents that look very much like treaties and were negotiated very much like treaties, but they're called agreements. And they had to be approved by both houses of Congress, not just the Senate. You also get executive orders, which was another way to have some reservations that were actually established by executive order, not by treaty. That was another way that the federal government formed relationships with the tribes after that 1871 treaty-making period. So, although you don't have treaties after 1871, you do still have documents that form the basis of those relationships and the basis of the law. So where do you find these treaties? Actually, there are several sources, but for the most part, they're not hard to find. Because treaties had to be ratified by Senate, and then later the agreements had to be approved by both the House and the Senate, they are in the United States statutes at large, the chronological arrangement of all of the laws that Congress passes. Volume 7 of the statutes at large was a special volume that included all of the treaties up through 1842. So earlier treaties, you can just go to Volume 7, they're going to be in there. That, however, is not going to include most of the treaties in the West, which were done more in the 1850s. They are in the statutes at large, but throughout the statutes at large, depending on their date. Another, here's what I have. Probably my go-to source, though, is Kapler's Indian Affairs, Laws, and Treaties. And it's actually a 7-volume set, and we'll come back to some of the other volumes later. But Volume 2 includes all of the treaties from 1778 through 1883, which actually goes beyond the treaty-making period, so it includes some of those agreements. So you essentially have them in this one volume right here. I don't have the link here, but later on in the slideshow there is a link to this online. And it's very easy to use. There is an index in the back by tribe. So you can just look up your tribe in the tribal index and it will lead you right to the treaty or treaties. Many tribes have more than one in here. So either the print or the online source is kind of the go-to. It does, however, only include ratified treaties. Kapler worked for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and he, in that job, kept the files of the treaties. And so that's where these were drawn from. There are other kinds of documents and agreements that are not formal treaties, so they're not included here. There's also treaties that were never ratified that might they wouldn't necessarily have legal impact, but they would perhaps be able to historically inform treaty interpretation. So unratified treaties, other agreements, there's another 2-volume set that includes all of these by Vine DeLorean. That is not available online, but we do have it in the library. And it includes, it's meant to be a supplement to Kapler's. It includes all these other kinds of agreements. So treaties with Texas, treaties with the Confederate States, things that weren't the US government, includes all those treaties, includes agreements, includes treaties that were between 2 tribes or 3 tribes or a group of tribes. So tribes also made treaties with each other. All of those are included in that set if you're looking for something that goes beyond Kapler's. Generally, Kapler's will be sufficient when you're talking about current legal research, because that is where the basis is. One thing, though, that could be, depending on the issue, there are railroad agreements. There were agreements with the tribes made with the railroads that are also in this particular set. Just a couple others. The Montana Indian Law Portal we already talked about does have the treaties with the Montana tribes, which are the ones you might be most interested in depending on what your issue is. And then Hein Online, that American Indian Law Collection, also has them. Okay. Questions so far? I talk fast, so. Okay, I'll keep going. So finding the treaties is one thing, but when you have a legal case, what is at issue is how do you interpret the treaty? And there still are, these are a couple of slides taken from a 1997 case that had to do with the treaty with the Yakima. So you can see that even recently, these treaties are still litigated, and fairly often actually. So what is at issue is how do you interpret those? And the basic rule, for lack of a better term, is that treaties should be interpreted as the tribes would have understood them. And so when you're talking about treaty interpretation, you're often looking at historical sources to determine what the context of the treaty negotiations, what was said, what wasn't said, what would the tribes have understood, what were kind of the historical and cultural parameters that would have informed the tribe's understanding of this treaty negotiation. So we're in some ways getting a little bit out of legal research here and getting into some historical research in kind of a legal context. I didn't bring this book, but there is a book called Kapler Revisited, and it's like this big. It's just the tiniest little book. But what it does, I didn't bring it because I used to have a picture of it on the slide, but what it does is for every treaty that is in Kapler's, it lists where in some of these historical sources you can find these historical documents. And I'm going to go through a couple of these. Well, they're all interesting. I tend to get lost doing this kind of research because it's really interesting and I get off track. But some of these, when you're talking, and one of the things that can be an issue is what are the boundaries of Indian lands. And this Indian land cession in the United States is actually a map set, kind of, that gathered together all of the land cessions from tribes to the federal government in all of the treaties and mapped them. So you can look at, I'm just going to browse by tribe, and in class I always use the example of the Makah tribe. We go through all of these resources, kind of compiling a history of the Makah tribe in Washington. And what this set does is pull out of the treaties the provisions where there was a land cession, and it gives you the exactly what the boundaries of that cession were. So it gives you the provision in the treaty, but also links to a map that shows you the area. And these are really pretty maps, and they're all numbered. So actually what we're talking about in that particular session is this little point of Washington up there. But these historical maps are very useful for showing where lands were and where lands were ceded. And we actually used it in a question that somebody in Native American Studies had about where there were some common buffalo hunting grounds set up in Montana, and we were trying to figure out where those were in Montana. So we were able to use this set to help kind of pin that down. Whoops. Wrong slide. Okay, so that's one set. This next one is kind of my favorite one. The list of documents, now I forgot, the list of documents concerning negotiations of ratified and unratified treaties with the various Indian tribes. It has a really long name and a not beautiful website, but a lot of really great information. And the treaties are just listed in order. I still have not quite figured out what happened to the first 29 treaties, but there's a separate page for treaty number 6. But in any case, you can see if I scroll through the kinds of documents that it contains. And it's going to vary from treaty to treaty. So some of them you get letters from the negotiators back to the Department of Interior, back to the Secretary of Interior, or Secretary of War in some cases, depending who was doing the negotiations. You may get unratified versions of the treaty. You may have versions of the treaty with handwritten notes that a negotiator or somebody back in Washington wrote. Here's an original copy of this treaty number 35. So all sorts of things, depending on, some of them are instructions from the War Department or from the Department of Interior to the negotiators. I am just, and they're listed in order, I'm just to kind of show you the treaty with the Makah, and all the treaties have chronological numbers that carries throughout these resources. So once you find your treaty number, you can use it in various resources. So the treaty with the Makah has, which was ratified in 1850, the 1855 treaty. You can see there's a record of the council proceedings over 2 days. So that's a pretty long record. We'll look at it in a second. A rough draft of the treaty. So you could compare perhaps what was put in later, what was taken out as part of the negotiations. The report on the treaty. So if I click on this link, and then click on this link again, I get the actual documents. Now don't be fooled by the fact that this one is nicely typed, because here is the first document. Some of the documents are typed, some of the documents look like this. And every year in class we spend time trying to read this. So these are fascinating documents that could actually lend a lot to an interpretation of a treaty, but you may have to, sit down for a while with your magnifying glass and work through and figure some things out. But yeah, so this is over 2 days kind of a journal of what happened at the negotiations, which could definitely help you determine, well, what were the tribes thinking. Of course, this is a journal written by, you have to think about who kept it too, keep that in mind. It's a journal written by the negotiators, probably. I don't know exactly who wrote this one. I'm guessing not the tribes. So you have to remember your viewpoint as you're researching some of these sources. Some of these other ones are not, they're not online, is why they're not linked. But there are, the treaties themselves, of course, are old. Historical documents that are just not easily available, but they have all been microfilmed. We're all available on microfilm. We don't have them here. They do have them at Mansfield Library. They have the microfilm of all of them. If for some reason you needed to go back to the handwritten treaty, but generally you don't need to do that. Some of these other things, though, are all more historical resources that you can use to look up things about the background of the tribes, some cultural aspects of the tribes, things about language. Some of them, this one of the best one of these sources is the Handbook of North American Indians, which this Smithsonian started publishing in 1978 and has still not finished. I think it's up to 13 volumes now, but there's volumes missing. We have a copy of that in the library, and Mansfield also has a copy of all of the volumes that are available. But that is actually a very good historical source. National Archives records. Another interesting source, though, the American Indian documents in the Congressional Serial Set. The serial set kind of gathers, not everything Congress does, but essentially what is done in the making of all of the laws. So it's a good place to get committee reports and other documents that were submitted to Congress, other reports that were submitted to Congress, end up in the Congressional Serial Set. And I just pulled out an example here of one that mentions the macaw. And it's actually about fur seal regulations, because the macaw still are whaling. I don't know if it's seal anymore, I don't think they do. Tribe, and so they would have, this document would potentially have information that you could use to show, here were their traditional fishing, sealing, hunting grounds, or something like that if you needed to establish that. So there's all kinds of things. The serial set itself is many, many, many volumes that would take over our library, so we don't have it, but Mansfield Library does have an online version that you can search. And you'll find on that online version Department of Interior documents, Department of War documents, so BIA documents, all of those kinds of documents are going to end up in the serial set. Another interesting source that I added, actually, this is not in Kapler's list, but are photographs. And there are some sources this is from the National Archives, but there are some collections of photographs. Photographs are actually an interesting way to kind of establish cultural practices, establish even territory. I used to be the librarian at Salish Kootenai College, and we had a collection of photographs. And at one point, and I actually don't know for sure what was being worked on, but they were having tribal elders come in and look at the photographs because they were trying to identify areas along, they were mostly photographs of fishing is what they were looking at, but areas along the river where the tribe was, so they could establish that that was traditional territory that the tribe fished. I think that's what they were trying to do. So photographs can be interesting, and there are some interesting collections of photographs. This is just one good collection that I linked to here. So they too are very interesting, and I do tend to get sidetracked also in those. So when you get to, I guess my kind of takeaway from all of this is when you get to a place where you are doing treaty interpretation and trying to figure out the application of a treaty, it's not necessarily going to be something you look in one place and find, here's what you need to know about this treaty. It is going to be a matter of looking in several different places and seeing what you can glean from all of these different sources. And it's definitely a matter of researching, I'm going to say researching critically, reading historical documents and figuring out how does this apply to this particular treaty, and how can I use these arguments. Okay, so after the treaty making period, I mentioned one of the ways that the federal government created relationships, again for lack of a better term, with tribes was through executive order. Executive orders are, and you've heard, presidents now, they issue executive orders for all sorts of different things. But essentially they are issued by the executive branch. And in theory, they are issued by the executive branch to the executive branch, and they're like management documents, but they can also set a lot of policy in how you manage. So one of the things that was done in many cases was either establish reservations or change the boundaries of reservations, which just because a reservation was established by treaty does not mean it stayed that way. There may have been a later executive order that changed some of those boundaries. In theory, executive orders should all be in one place, but they're not. This one seems so simple to me, like why can't we have a comprehensive set of executive orders? No. They are now, all executive orders are now in the Federal Register. However, the Federal Register did not exist until 1934. So many of these documents, executive orders that we're talking about dealing with tribes, predate the Federal Register. So already that takes out that source. Newer ones, certainly they will be in the Federal Register. They're also now in codified in Title III of the Code of Federal Regulations. Also not helpful because that didn't exist until 1936. One sources are compilations of presidential documents. Those are available on Hein Online, and you can kind of dig through those and hope you can find them. I actually always start with the American Presidency Project. Oops, I forgot to change my link in here. Before I email you this, I will change my link to the American Presidency Project, but the American Presidency Project actually does claim to be a comprehensive source of executive orders and presidential proclamations. They're listed by president, so you kind of have to know the date. They are searchable. They're not comprehensive. For example, Roosevelt's. There's a whole bunch of Roosevelt's missing, but it is a very good place to start. There's also, and this is probably a better place to start, I just showed you one volume of Kapler's. Kapler's is actually a 7-volume set, and the rest of the volumes are chronological by date. So if you search Kapler's online, it will pull and this is the online version, and it shows you what's in the rest of the volumes. The executive orders are included in the rest of the volumes. So Kapler's will get you through 1971. And then after that, the Federal Register and Lexis and West, for that matter, will have them. So Kapler's is a good source also of those executive orders. Westlaw, if you do have Westlaw and Lexis available to you, Westlaw and Lexis also have executive order databases. And Lexis particularly has databases that are specifically executive orders pertaining to tribes. So that's a good source for those. There is also, this one up here, this book, Executive Orders Relating to Indian Reservations from 1855 through 1922. One of the things when you're doing any of this research is always look at the dates on your sources, because they vary a lot. So 1855 is before the end of the treaty making period, so 1922 is going to get you through after that. This is just a scan. Yeah, there we go. I'll just give you an example, a scan from the page. And this does have this set, it's 2 little orange books, does have a tribal index, so you can look up your tribe in there and look up, here's just one from the Makah Reservation, and you can see it was, the reservation itself was established by treaty, but then they changed it through a series of executive orders. So it would be important, not just when you're talking about tribal boundaries, not just to have the treaty, but also to see if there were any additional executive orders that came along later that might have changed that. Okay. Another unique source when you're talking about Indian law research are Indian claims. And the Indian claims also has an interesting history. Before 1946, if a tribe had a claim against the federal government for land taking or any tribe they had against the federal government, they actually were precluded from bringing that unless they went to Congress and got an order for special jurisdiction. So first they had to petition Congress, and then they could go to the Court of Claims, and they went to the regular Court of Claims. However, in 1946, there were so many of these claims that Congress established the Indian Claims Commission. And the parameters of that were claims had to arise before 1946. The tribes had until 1951 to file their claims, and then the commission was supposed to hear all of these claims in 10 years. In 1978, and you could see there were 370 petitions that some of them were split. There was more than one claim, so there was over 600 claims. In 1978, they still were not done with their 10-year work. And the Indian Court of Claims was abolished, and everything went back to the Court of Claims. All the existing cases were transferred to, there were 102 at that time, transferred to the Court of Claims, which is now the Court of Federal Claims. There are still, I don't know how many, but there are still some that are open cases in the Court of Federal Claims. And there are still now newer ones being, tribes can now file claims in the Court of Federal Claims. So during the Indian Court of Claims, though, the process actually generated some interesting documents, both that were useful for determining the claim, but also I think can be useful for when we talk about treaty interpretation. There were some interesting historical documents in there. It was kind of a three-step process. First, the tribes had to establish title, and that actually looked at some of those negotiating documents. It might have had ethnological studies, anthropological studies that were included, sometimes expert testimony, executive orders. All of that kind of went into the stage where they were establishing title. Then they had to value land, and the value was, when they were land claims, value of the land on the date it was ceded, which also took expert appraisal, because you're talking about a historical appraisal. And then they looked at whether the tribe had received any payments in either money or goods. So a lot of times, yes, they did receive payments, but they were not near what the value is. So what the value was. So the claim is that they should have received additional compensation. And that's what the claim is for. So all of this generated a lot of documents that the Indian Claims Commission decisions themselves, since the Indian Claims Commission had a fixed period of time, all of their opinions are available online. And you can search it, or there is also a tribal index. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to keep going. So you can look at all of those decisions. The other thing, though, is there is an index to all of that expert testimony that was generated. And again, this goes back to kind of doing some of that historical research. These numbers are claims numbers. So I think the Macaw, I think it was like 61 or something like that, I can't remember. But different claims are going to have different expert testimony documents. You can see there's several appraisal documents here. All of these documents, this is just the index, all of the documents are available on microfiche over at Mansfield. So if you needed to dig this deeply, you could. We actually had somebody in here several years ago who had borrowed the microfiche from Mansfield and was doing the research here. So it is not necessarily unheard of type research, even in current cases, to dig into some of these older documents. The current Court of Claims reports are available, Lexis, Westlaw, and online, so you can get those decisions. Compacts, I want to get to tribal law, so I'm going to kind of skip through compacts fairly quickly. Compacts are basically negotiated agreements between governments, and there's all sorts of compacts. The ones that are most important for us, of course, are compacts between tribes and usually state governments. And we're often talking about taxation, gaming, environment, and then in Montana, the water compacts are the big ones that we all hear about most often. There's a few different places you can look for those compacts. Actually, the Federal Register is a good source. There's also a couple of lists that you can get to them. The Montana ones with the Montana state are actually in the statutes because although they have to be, the legislature has to agree to them. So you'll find ones with the state of Montana in the Montana Code annotated. I'm going to skip special topics for a second and maybe come back to it and go into researching tribal law. So when we're researching federal law, we know the sources, the United States Code, the cases, we know the reporters, we just talked about some of the special things. When we are researching tribes, there's not necessarily one go-to place. Remember, we're talking about 366 tribes we're talking about 366 tribes, so their laws may be in different places. Couple of good sources, though, to start looking at those. Tribal constitutions. Not all tribes have constitutions. In 1934, with the Indian Reorganization Act, many tribes at that point did adopt constitutions, which, when you look at them, are all quite similar. Not necessarily identical, though, but they have many similar provisions. Some tribes had constitutions that predated 1934 and still have those constitutions. Others have IRA-era constitutions, and others still don't have constitutions at all. Good sources to look for them. This Native American Constitution and Law Digitization Project it's from the University of Oklahoma, and its kind of purpose is to gather tribal constitutions. Another good place, though, and I want to make sure I show you this, is the National Indian Law Library Tribal Law Gateway. This is the National Indian Law Library. I said they've been kind of the repository for tribal law materials, and they have been making those available online. So this is just a tribal, list, and you can see it includes Alaska Native villages and not just some of the reservations that we are used to. And for any of these, I'm going to go to Crow just to show you. It's all in alphabetical order. So on this list, Tribal Montana, what you can see is it links to their codes and their constitutions and their tribal court opinions if they are online. It will also, for their tribal codes, if there is not an online version of the tribal code, they will note that the National Indian Law Library has a copy of the code, and you can call them and say, I need this provision from this code, or write to them that way, so they are very good. The other thing that you can do, and we'll go back to the Tribal Law Gateway, is you can search. So if you are, if you have an issue and you want to see what tribes may have a code provision on that issue, you can search on here. We're actually doing, later today, that's my animal law class in there, and we are talking about tribal animal law. And so I just use this to search on the term animals to see which tribes have, animal control codes, or I also searched on wildlife to see which ones had wildlife codes. And actually that search feature is new with the new website, so I was pretty darn excited to find it last night. That is one of the best sources for searching both constitutions and tribal codes. The other thing, of course, is try going to the tribe's website. Many times now, not always, but many times you will find their codes on their own website. Tribal cases is a little bit different because we're not talking about one federal court system or one state court system. We're talking about 300 different court systems, some of which are going to have their cases available, some of which aren't. The Indian Law Reporter is a print reporter, and the Indian Law Reporter itself doesn't actually exist in an online version. But it publishes both federal Indian law cases, so cases from state and federal courts on Indian law issues, as well as tribal court opinions, but not from all tribal courts. There is no comprehensive every tribal court kind of source. But it's, like I said, only in print, but the National Indian Law Library has an index, and they're continuing to index it. So let's say they want cases on taxation. You will get the citations to those cases. Now what you can do then is copy and paste that and put it in an email to me, and I will scan the case from the Indian Law Reporter and send it right back to you. So that's probably the best way to get, to search kind of across tribes for different ways different tribes may have handled some of those issues. And the last thing I do want to point out, the Northwest Intertribal Court System, the tribes in Washington, Western Washington, have an intertribal court system, and their appellate opinions they have searchable on this website. And it's actually a pretty good, has a really good search engine that you can use, like some of the operators that you are used to using in Westlaw and Lexis. You can use in their search engine, and it's searching full text of opinions. So that source is in here, over here on the side is where it came up with it. It also has a tribal index and a topic index too, so you don't have to search just by keywords. You can use those indexes. And that's the end. And I left all of 1 minute for questions, but I'll hang around if you have any ones here too. If you have some additional questions, feel free to ask. All right, thank you for coming.